Thanks for the chance to get together with you this morning and hopefully say something that's helpful as far as getting your manuscript published. As Stuart said, well, I graduated from topical editor now to associate editor for optometry and vision science, meaning I see just about every manuscript that comes across the editorial desk. Optometry and vision science is a pretty traditional journal. We stopped being print and have moved along to online only in the last couple of years, but in all other respects we're pretty traditional in that we're peer reviewed, and the publishing landscape is evolving quite a bit. I think I could probably be on the editorial board of about 2 journals a week if I answered every email that was soliciting me to become part of some journal I've never heard of in an area that's not really my area of expertise. I've always played with the idea of, well, what if I answered one of those, sort of like, the solicitation emails that you get from particular countries saying that someone is trying to put $2 million into your account and, if you just respond to me, you could be rich. And there was some thread where somebody actually did that, and it turned into something pretty amusing. And the publishing landscape these days with so many online journals or journals that you may not be familiar with or have never heard of before. A TV character from days of old. I don't suppose, a show of hands, how many have ever heard of the television show Bonanza? Well, maybe we could pick something, thank you. We could pick something a little bit more recent, but a character from this TV show from the 60s, Hoss Cartwright, is apparently now on the editorial board of about 7 different journals that you've never heard of. As I say, we're fairly traditional, but I think we've got some insights that we can share with you. Even in this age of the digital age and online only. It seems like getting your manuscript published. I mean, why should this be so complicated? Why don't you have an awesome idea, run some very successful experiments, come up with some really interesting and powerful and compelling results, write it up in a clear and concise manner, send it in. What's the big deal? Well, apparently there are some pitfalls along the way that trip people up. Yeah, easy, huh? Well, authorship is one place where there are pitfalls, and it's my point here is that it should be an early avoidance on your part of those pitfalls. Authorship, who's in and who's out, should be a discussion that you have very early. And it's very easy to forget that you should be having that discussion as you begin a project or a collaboration. You have sort of this circle of people who maybe are in a room together talking about ideas. You're thinking about who out there knows how to do what I'm trying to do, has a particular instrument that may help me, a particular reagent, particular mouse line, something along those lines is associated with my mentor or associated with my collaborator. Are they in or are they out? And the criteria for authorship that you should be thinking about and having a conversation about what this person's role might be as you develop your project is number 1, that they are going to contribute to any one of these areas. Doesn't have to be all of these areas, but at least one of these areas in a substantial way. Concept, design, getting the data and interpreting the data. So concept or design of the study sound a little bit more obvious as being substantial roles that merit authorship. I think that's where most of us are oriented in. Yeah, that's authorship level. Data acquisition sometimes is a little bit dicey, a little bit more confusing. Just because somebody is collecting data, are they an author? Are they in? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We have optometrists who are meant to see the patients in some of our clinical studies. Sometimes they've been authors, and sometimes they haven't. And it's really the part of the first bullet and the second bullet that make the difference is, are they intellectually engaged or not? Is their role strictly technical, or is there some intellectual engagement? And that intellectual engagement carries them into the second bullet. That is, they're somehow involved in meaningfully drafting the manuscript and contributing to the manuscript. All authors must know what's in the paper, know of the existence of the paper, which apparently in some disciplines, cultures, is not always an obvious or an automatic. But approve the manuscript and be responsible for its content. And approval of the manuscript, many journals these days have a trigger when a manuscript is submitted. As you put in the emails of your co-authors, emails will get triggered to those co-authors, email addresses of your co-authors, then the emails get triggered and everybody has to sign on. So hopefully the days of slapping down a manuscript in front of somebody, or sending an email attachment, or getting a correct congratulations from a coworker where, hey, nice paper, and you go, what paper, are over. That email trigger system solves that little problem. So substantial contribution and intellectual engagement and participation in the manuscript and approval of the manuscript. That makes the difference about whether somebody's in or somebody's out. So have that discussion and understanding early. As you're amassing the resources you need to do your project, make it clear who's in and who's out. Or as people come into a project, have that as part of the conversation. Not only what are you going to do for me, what's your role, but is it authorship level or not? Certainly there is such a thing as gift authorship. Somebody referred cases. As I say, somebody provided an instrumentation or did an assay, but they don't meet the other criteria for authorship, but you just don't want to offend them. Or they know somebody who's important to you and you don't want to offend either of those people. Gift authorship occurs. Obviously, it's something you want to try and avoid, and think of those criteria for authorship as a way to judge whether they really should be in or out. Science is more collaborative these days and larger. The single investigator laboring away in his or her lab and having single authored publications. I don't see that very often. So there's a tendency maybe for authorship lists to become very, very long. And the way to keep that from becoming meaningless authorship is a lot of journals are asking for. So define your contribution. Click boxes or pull down and say what part of this chain of completion of a project that constitute authorship level did you actually participate in? And let each author see and agree or disagree with whether that was an accurate representation. If somebody provides technical assistance but doesn't really rise to the authorship level, there is the possibility of acknowledgement. I think the rules and appropriate use of acknowledgement still means that somebody who's acknowledged needs to know that they're being acknowledged and agree with the content of the paper. So acknowledgement, you should be sending the draft to that person who's being acknowledged so they know that their name is being invoked and that they agree to have their name mentioned. And also, if they disagree, why am I acknowledged instead of being an author? You can have that discussion. But if you had the discussion earlier, then you'd avoid that little bit of discomfort. I don't know what career stage everybody's at, but if you have a mentor at this stage or are in a junior faculty status and have more senior people involved, they can be helpful or they can be part of the problem. And that's a difficult situation to navigate through. Hopefully you have the mentor who's more on the helpful side, and as I say here, is running interference for you and is experienced with these delicate authorship issues, rather than a mentor who's trying to pressure you into situations where you know what the ideal is, and that's about where you want to start in your career, is achieving the ideal. But there might be some discussion of, well, in this case we need to do it this way, and trying to get you to compromise yourself maybe a little bit. Hopefully that's not part of your situation. So mentors can be helpful, and mentors can be part of the problem. In the Mary Poppins School of Science, well begun is half done, and that means having an experiment or study that has a solid design is a really awesome way to start to be producing publishable science. So as I look at a manuscript and I'm thinking about, should I send this out for review or should it be rejected out of hand? And that's sort of the way our journal operates. It comes into the associate editor. Well, first the managing editor checks and sees, did you read the instructions for authors? And is it formatted appropriately for our journal? And have you taken out the other journal's name where it was rejected and now you're trying with us? Because that sort of stuff makes a very good impression when you've got the journal right and the format right. So the managing editor sees it first, makes sure that you follow the instructions for authors. Then it comes to my desk as the associate editor, and I will make a decision, is this worthy of review or should I reject it out of hand because it just isn't either appropriate for our journal or doesn't meet our standards. What I'm looking for is first, is this study worth our reviewers' time? Because reviewers get asked to review a lot, and these days with the world of science, not just the United States of science, there's a lot of material coming in. In the last, 10 years or so, I think our number of submissions have gone up by a factor of about 4. So our reviewers are working hard. Our community really hasn't grown by a factor of 4, but our submissions have grown by a factor of 4, and that's probably true for a lot of journals. So I'm thinking about reviewer time, and I'm not just sending everything out for review. So the potential is there for me to reject it out of hand. Getting back to my point, what I'm starting out looking for is this question worth reviewers' time and ultimately our readers' time? I want to see that you've reviewed the literature and come up with something original and important. That you're not just doing, 4 people have seen this and it's pretty much a consensus, but I needed a project and so let's just try it a 5th time. Okay, this is not going to provide value to the journal, citations, improve our impact factor, and be interesting to our readers. So I always like an introduction that tells a story and ends with a punchline. Give me something at the end of your introduction that, this field is hopelessly confused, yet I have identified the source of the controversy and I am going to clarify things for everyone. Or, we just don't know and I have figured out how we're going to fill in this gap. So I love a punchline, and that punchline, my favorite punchlines are filling in a knowledge gap or resolving a controversy because of your unique insights. If your particular study requires a lot of statistical analysis, I'll tell you, working with biostatisticians in my area, they would much rather build houses than repair damaged ones. They like to be there early and have input from the get-go. They do not like to be called in because you've got some intractable problem that you think statistical magic can get you out of. They want input early. So if you feel like statistical analysis is going to be central to what you're doing, or the design elements are not your particular expertise, bring them in early. Bring them in early so that you have the appropriate sample size. You know, you have a study where you've got marginal results. The numbers are in the direction that you think validates your hypothesis, but your study's underpowered because you have an inadequate sample size. Or you've just spent, you know, $50,000 you didn't need to because you did twice the number of subjects that the study actually required. Or you did twice the number of subjects that your study required, and you have this statistically significant but clinically not so meaningful result. And so your paper is overpowered and you're reporting a trivial difference, or your paper is underpowered and you think you've got something important, but your p-values just aren't behaving. And then elements of study design. The statistical community, the clinical research community has great experience in appropriate masking procedures, randomization schemes. And between you and your expertise in your field and their statistical expertise, the whole game, I think, in patient-based research is accounting for variables that will mislead you. That is, reducing the potential for confounding variables and not properly accounting for them, or bias. So this is just meant to show you a screenshot of a reference manager. As I say, let's get our research organized here. Obviously, I would think everybody would be using a reference manager at this stage. This is a screenshot of EndNote. It's one that I like. There are many other versions. Obviously, use a reference manager. My main point in showing this slide is really something that I only started to do about a couple of years ago. So if you're not doing it, if you are doing it, great. If you aren't, maybe this is helpful to you. I had a very senior colleague call me and says, how do you manage your PDFs? Okay, we used to have file drawers, you know, and you'd have different folders and alphabetize the authors, and you put it in the folder, so maybe you remembered where the heck that paper was from, you know, 10 years ago on this particular topic. So now everything's a PDF. How do you organize your PDFs so that you can easily retrieve the study that you want? Not the study that came out last week, you know what that one is, but the study that came out 5 years ago that you're trying to remember on a particular point. So, you know, develop a file naming system that makes sense to you. And I sort of do, you know, author last name, and then as full of the title as I can stick in the file name and journal and year. But this reference manager, once you've got the file name, that's fine. But this reference manager, you know, obviously if you've read the paper and you're storing it, it's going to be something you're going to want to cite. But to cite it, it helps to be able to find it. Once you add a particular citation to your reference manager, at least EndNote, and I'm sure the others do too, allows you to attach the PDF to the citation. So you can see I've been, you know, diligent enough on some of these. The paperclip here, okay, I actually have that PDF tied to that citation. You know, it's too late for me. I'm too far downstream. I didn't develop this habit soon enough. So I have many references here where I haven't bothered to do that. If you're early enough in your career, let this be a lesson to keep doing this. So it does two things. Not only does it help you know where your PDF is, but in EndNote, I highlight this searchable field here. You can search the PDFs. I said my example is, what was that paper on time outdoors and myopia? I know it was from China. I don't know the author. I'm not familiar with that group. So it's time outdoors and China, and they had a negative result. And these are searchable fields. If I type in time outdoors, China, that paper comes up, not because it's searching the citation fields, but it's searching the actual PDF. And I will find it and have found it. And this has been tremendously helpful in terms of staying organized. So attach your PDFs to your reference manager, and hopefully your reference manager allows you not only to search the authors and titles and abstracts that are within the software itself, but it also searches the attachable PDFs. So the field, the searchable field there that I've got in blue says PDF. It searches the document. I thought that was an awesome, awesome addition to the power of a reference manager. Obviously, if you're working with human subjects, you have to have IRB review. You have to make that statement. Manuscripts still come in that don't reference IRB review and conformance with the Declaration of Helsinki, and that informed consent actually took place. And those will go back to the author. If it's a clinical trial, clinical trials should be pre-registered in a database. Clinicaltrials.gov is very common in the United States. And the reporting has to follow particular guidelines that are outlined in this thing called the consort statement. So this has been a little bit more contentious in the last year or so. Not that this definition of a clinical trial is new, but it's like people have sort of become more aware of it recently because it's going to be part of what you put in your grant proposals. But the NIH definition of a clinical trial, one or more human subjects. Okay, so are you using human subjects? Prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, basically you do something, and evaluate the effect of those interventions on a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome. Basically, you do something and you measure something. Okay, now this has caused a lot of confusion. You go on the internet and you'll find the discussion boards about, doesn't this seem a little broad? This is a little different than my concept of a clinical trial a year ago. My concept of a clinical trial a year ago still conforms to this definition of clinical trial phases that's still part of the NIH definition. But if we get down into phase 2 or phase 3, it's like I'm interested in a treatment, not necessarily a health-related outcome, but I'm interested in a health-related therapeutic intervention in the sense of treatment, and I want to know about safety and I want to know about efficacy. Okay, so those are still part of NIH definitions of the phases of, I think the phrasing is becoming traditional clinical trials. But that's not to say that what you're doing isn't a clinical trial. If it involves human subjects and you do something and you measure something that's either health or behavioral as an outcome. I had an example where we're measuring refractive error, myopia, and hyperopia are my particular topic areas. And we're interested, I mentioned time outdoors, we're interested in the effect of light exposure in children on the development of their prescriptions. And so we had a study of adults, and we had adult subjects spend a week in trying to get a lot of time outdoors and spend a week where they spend a lot of time indoors, and then measured pupil function because pupil is going to reflect the response of certain cells in the retina that we think might be important. So I would call that an experiment because I'm not proposing this as some sort of therapeutic intervention. I just want to vary conditions and see how the response that I'm interested in changes. You know, I have a colleague who will want to look at some psychophysical perceptual function as a function of, say, brightness of her environment in the laboratory. That would be what I would call an experiment. These are clinical trials by the new definition. So relative to, or relevant to publication, we had an editor's meeting for our journal and says, if this is the NIH definition of a clinical trial, are we going to require pre-registration? Like, is this going to have to go into clinicaltrials.gov before we'll look at it as a journal? Is reporting going to have to follow the consort statement rather than what we usually see as the reporting in a journal of an experiment? And our decision was no, that we would require pre-registration in a database like clinicaltrials.gov and consort format more for the traditional clinical trials. So I think your relationship between your study and the journal you want to go to is maybe going to end up being dependent on what journal that is and what their philosophy is on this. As far as grant submission goes, what you do may well be a clinical trial even though you don't think of it that way. As far as reporting the results of your experiment, your journal is probably going to be evolving in, are they going to require pre-registration and adherence to the consort statement. Picking your journal. My advice to my students and myself is gauge it by what you read. You get a sense of your community's literature by the papers that you read in preparation for your experiment and supporting your experiment. You get an idea of what the topic areas are for each of the journals in your community and how good those journals are and how good your experiment is. I would always say aim as high as possible. Rejection can often be very quick, and then you move along. What's high? Journal reputation. As I say, alignment with message. As you say, rejection is fast and you can move along. Judging journal quality, impact factor is very traditional. Impact factor is the number of citations that a journal receives over a 2-year period divided by the number of articles published in that 2-year period. So it's sort of the average number of citations per article in this 2-year period. These are some I journals. These are all available for your community in online databases. Aim for a high impact factor. Those of you who are junior faculty, I also serve on the Committee on Academic Freedom and Responsibility. And some of the controversial cases from faculty who are upset with their tenure review, some of the issues have occasionally been, I published in journals that are appropriate for my research, but my voting faculty colleagues had a different list in their head. And unfortunately, that's the way our system works, that faculty get to vote based on their somewhat objective and somewhat subjective impressions of your quality, the quality of your case. I think it would do you well to understand the culture of your unit to understand what are the good journals that my tenured voting faculty colleagues are going to be looking for. And if you've got the need to be someplace else because your work is really new and this journal is really appropriate for my stuff, they need to understand that situation and that this journal that you're picking is quality and that your work is quality. So there are some objective criteria that you can put in your dossier for the impact factor in the journals where you're publishing, but beware the secret list and understand the culture of your colleagues so that you are in the places that they want to see you publish in. The basic writing of your material, say here are 4 C's. You know, just say less better. Say less better is, I think, always good advice. That is, can you work harder to be more concise and clear? There was a very good book that I read recently called Do I Make Myself Clear? Harold Evans, he was a newspaper writer and newspaper and magazine editor. Do I Make Myself Clear? And this was given to me as a birthday present by my longtime collaborator. So I think there was like some secret message in there because I'm kind of well known in my circle as, you know, if there's a long sentence, I can make it longer. If I can somehow twist up a sentence structure, that's what I'm going to do. And I have worked very hard over my career to look at my own work just a little bit harder. And say, are there too many words? Is my sentence too long? How can I take out the unnecessary words, the sentence-killing extra words, or untwist this sentence, or break up this sentence so that it fits into a better rhythm in the paragraph, and just say it better. Just say it better. Advice I usually give to my students about speaking is if you're earlier in your career and starting to give talks, try and give your talk while you're looking at yourself in the mirror. I don't know if any of you ever played that game, but man, that is really disturbing, okay? You know, you're looking, it's like, who are you? What do you look funny? Your mouth is moving. What is this tick you're doing? Okay, you are totally distracted trying to give your talk, looking at yourself in the mirror. And the game is, can you ignore all of that and get into your material? If you can ignore your own face giving this talk and give your talk, it means you can get yourself into the zone and really concentrate on your material and deliver your message. So the analogous trick in writing that we do is, will you read that sentence out loud? Will you read that sentence you wrote out loud? How does it really sound to you? And so you perceive it in a different way. In your own head, it's poetry. Out loud, it sounds a little different. It sounds as awful as it sounded to the person who didn't write it. So that's a trick that we often use with each other is, you know, I don't understand this sentence. Go ahead, read it out loud. How's it sounding now? Not so good. What's the problem? Yeah, too many words, too long, too twisted. You haven't built up. My favorite thing is going from A to about H. And my colleagues will say, I don't know, you made some jump. I need A, B, C, D. And then, you know, maybe H comes a little later. Tell me the story, build it up piece by piece. Don't be so unaware that you're talking to an audience that didn't do what you did, that you're afraid to build it up piece by piece. So these are just famous quotes from people who have had some success in their writing is, yeah, my letter is so long because I haven't taken the time to make it shorter. Or as a former English major, an admirer of Joyce, his perspective was the artist shouldn't be aware of the writer as you're reading. You should be in the writer's world, but not aware of the writer's hand. So refined out of existence was Joyce's phrase for this. Your writing should be smooth. I mean, what do we talk about? You know, this paragraph needs to be smoothed out. This paragraph needs to be polished up. What does that mean? It means that the reader can work his or her way through it without stumbling on something clunky that you've written because you haven't refined it to be smooth and communicate what you're trying to communicate. Different tones in different phases of the publication process. Obviously, during the submission, you want to be, you know, clear and concise, as I said, and communicate your important work with the necessary scholarly tone. I say the review process is always funny. When you get your review back, you will be oh so tempted to try and put a face to the review. I say reviews are anonymous. But you're going to say, oh, the review that says, well, you have failed to cite the seminal work of so-and-so. And it's like, God, I knew that person would get it. Or so-and-so is always out to tube my career. You'll always want to put a face to who's in review. But the interesting thing is the managing editor for our journal is in our building. And he will always say, you know, you people always play this game. You'll say, oh, I know that was so-and-so. He says, I hear you. I hear what you're saying, but I know who the reviewer was. You are wrong 90% of the time. Okay, if it helps you write your response to review, to have a face to it, fine, play that game, but you're probably wrong. But the response is important here in that the reviews will make you angry. The reviews will make you feel like the reviewers are idiots and have missed the importance of what you're trying to say. But they're kind of in charge. And so what you need to do is accept or adopt this tone of grateful compliance. Thank you for their time and effort. Getting in an argument with a reviewer is not going to get you what you want because they're, they think they're as bright as you think you're bright. So it needs to be a respectful and data-driven, scholarly discussion where you try and make your point. Reviews usually say address all comments in a point-by-point manner. Do so. They can see the old review just like you can, and they'll know if you left something out. So get it all in there. And then just format the response. Some journals now are telling you how to format your response. The basic idea, whether they do or they don't, is you want to make the review clear enough of what did the reviewer say, and then what did you say, and whether you use indents and bold, or italics versus regular script, or background highlighting, some way distinguish what the reviewer said and then what you said. And let me just read an example here. This was a review, a response review that I wrote. The reviewer says, why are you citing chick papers? Chicks don't have a retinal structure of a fovea, they have an area centralis. So your chick reference is stupid. And I could have answered back, you think my chick reference is stupid, you missed the entire point that I really wasn't talking about the retina and the fovea. I was talking about the importance of the front of the eye's response versus the back of the eye's response. Chicks do have a front and a back. So, I say the point being made was not so much about foveal versus peripheral visual control. So I am making my point. But then in the end, I say the word foveal has been replaced by central. Give them something, okay? If it's possible to make your point but move to middle ground, the art of compromise and so forth, this will be helpful. This will be helpful. Don't be strident, don't be argumentative. Make your point, because obviously that's why you said it in the first place. But if you can meet them halfway, that would be awesome. So I say polite, scientific, make it clear what's the reviewer's point versus your point, follow the timeline, and say, depending on where you are in your career, hopefully you'll get requests for review. You might want to participate in the process. Not only is that good citizenship, but it's instructive. So you see it from the reviewer's perspective as well. These are some rejections, decisions, snippets, some I've written, some I've received. But just some ideas of major issues. This one is, this study did not have that important point at the very beginning. Justification was poor. And so it ended up saying, your conclusion that this condition, anisometropia, is primarily axial in nature is just not going to be of interest or value to our readers. Basically, everybody knows this. Why on earth did you do this study? So, rejected for not having a very strong purpose. This was a rejection. Your data were gathered with really updated technology, but you're extending your conclusions way beyond where your data are justified. Your modeling is taking your conclusions way beyond where your data have a right to be. That was that rejection. Confounding. There's a flaw in your study design that you didn't appreciate. Here there's a confounding variable. You have a refractive error group, and they're also going to have this condition, so you're potentially creating this false association. You didn't properly account for a confounding variable. This one's got just a little bit of everything. The language isn't up to acceptable English usage. And reviewers are not going to serve as editors. Nobody has the time for that. So hopefully that's not an issue for you all, but as a reviewer, it's not your responsibility to serve as a language editor. There are plenty of services for that, plenty of colleagues for that, so don't feel that burden. And we get submissions that sometimes don't meet acceptable English grammar and usage. Let's see, how many ways can this study go wrong? There's no clear hypothesis given. Methodological details are missing. Tables duplicate figures, so they stretched out content. Analysis is maybe just t-tests, and there are about 100 p-values. So the discussion goes off into hyperspace on irrelevant factors. Nobody in this room is going to make this many errors, but reasons that manuscripts might be rejected. So here are a couple of rejections that I received and lessons that I learned from receiving these rejections. The manuscript was deemed acceptable, but really it just didn't fit our journal's priority. And so we're not going to be able to publish your study. Now, it would have been helpful if I had received this advice a year earlier before I went through about 5 or 6 rounds of review and resubmission. So our journal's philosophy, Optometry and Vision Sciences philosophy of, I'm really not going to send your paper out for review unless I think it has a chance. I'm not going to string you along. I much prefer journals that play the game that way than journals that send papers out for review. You can satisfy the reviewer's objections. Most of the time, I like to think that we're on the path to publication. But be aware that that may not be the case. And it may not be the case, unfortunately, maybe with the higher impact journals. Just because it went out for review, just because you satisfied reviewers, you still might not make the final cut. In the second bullet, I thought I had the genetics result of a lifetime. Aimed high, went for Nature Genetics, and here was my failure to read the instructions for authors. They gently reminded me that one cohort wouldn't be enough. Their journal criteria called for 2 independent cohorts and sample sizes that were about 4 times the sample size I had. So no matter how awesome my results I thought I had, it wasn't going to go into this journal. But here's my final message. I'll end on this. Both those studies did eventually reach publication. And you know, the more you think about your science and how you're expressing it in your writing, those papers were better, ultimately. And they are in the literature and people can find them. So it's hateful to get a critical review. All of us would like all the affirmation that we can possibly stand. But rejections will happen. You will be challenged. You'll feel like you're being undermined. It will make you angry. But stay in the game. Dust yourself off. Get back in there and make it better. And that's what I would hope for all of you. So that's all I have. And I think we might have some time for some questions if people want to come to the microphone. Yeah, please. The question is, what's appropriate for the introduction?
Versus the first paragraph of the discussion of the manuscript.
Yeah, so I mean, I would look for, you know, what's sort of background and significance. I mean, why? What's the context for the question? What's the clinical problem that you're trying to address? You're trying to orient the reader into why I should care about your results. I mean, it's sort of like the introduction to your grant of make me care about what you're going to tell me in all the data and figures and tables and so forth. Give me the importance of your problem. give me enough background literature so I can understand the context of what we think we know about your problem, set up the reason for more data in your study, you sort of give me that, the controversy that you're going to clear up or the knowledge gap that you're going to fill. Does that mesh up with what your thinking is?
Kind of, just it's sometimes confused. It's sometimes overlapping, actually. I feel that the introduction and the beginning of your discussion.
Yes. So that's always a great issue in papers, sort of what belongs in the introduction and what belongs in the discussion. So, I mean, I think the discussion is where you have an opportunity to first summarize what you said, because people need repetition to really understand what you said. Compare your results. Now that you've presented your results, you can compare your results with what's gone in the past. So rather than just saying what we know from the past, now you can make an explicit compare and contrast of your results with what's known in the past. Strengths and limitations, and what you think it means in the larger world of the issue that you're trying to contribute to. So I say, is it background and significance in setting up the problem you're trying to solve, or is it your results and the past literature and what it means for the larger problem? That the first part is introduction and the second part is discussion. It's absolutely something that you always are going to think about, and it gets confused. I say outlining. I think I had a point in there about don't be too proud to outline. For clarity and to make sure you've got the storyline straight, I say don't be too proud to outline what you're trying to put in one section or another, or what point you're actually trying to make.
So along those same lines, I think it becomes very tricky because brevity is the rule of the game, and you have so
Brevity?
many. You have only so many lines you can fit in a paragraph. So recently, when we wrote a manuscript for the discussion, the first part of the discussion, do you think you just summarize your main points of your results in the last few lines and say, hey, this is what we found contrary or similar to what the previous literature states, and then you go on to your other paragraphs regarding your strength, limitations, etc., because it's so hard to fit in that first 10 lines everything that you want to say and also talk about a little bit of the introduction. So,
yeah, I think there are opportunities to practice what I would call, I don't know, the cocktail party or the family dinner version of your results, where you really are trying to give a very condensed summary of what you have to say. Sort of like in a grant submission, you have that very brief section to, what is this study really about? And maybe that's part of what you're trying to do, not to fill up a whole lot of lines, but to really, say less better. The phrase that we use in our group is, don't be afraid to kill your darlings. I spent so much time crafting this lovely sentence, but maybe it just doesn't sing as well and in tune as you think it does. Maybe you can make it shorter and still make it better. So, every sentence has to earn its place. Every sentence has to fulfill a function to make the cut. So I say it out loud, scan it. Is it really pulling its weight to have it in there? Right, because I had the same experience. I had an article in for one journal rejected it. Next journal I went to, I'll just move on to the next journal. Oh my God, it's got a 1,500 word fewer limit than what I submitted to the first journal. It's funny, a lot of stuff all of a sudden looks extraneous when they give you a hard word limit. So I say it was a very good book that my colleague Carla Zadnik, who's up next, they say, do I make myself clear? I told them Harold Evans' book was a great help to me and was a fantastic message to be delivered by a colleague that, hey, we can all do a little bit more work to trim things up a little bit. Say less better. Anyway, I think that's my time. Thanks very much for your attention.